You're listening to the TeenTix Arts Podcast, or TAP for short.
Here on TAP, we explore how teens and young people are engaging with music. What is the context that drives our local Seattle music scene?
What, how, why, and where are teens listening?
And maybe most importantly, how can you be involved?
We conduct interviews, dive into history, and more. I'm Xandra.
And I'm Olivia.
And today we'll be talking about scores and soundtracks in films.
How does music shape our film watching experience? And what significance does music have in cinema?
Some films that we'll talk about is Everything Everywhere All at Once, Shang-Chi, nominated films, and more.
I have a big connection to orchestra and just instrumental music in general because I play an orchestra, I play the viola, and it's just a really cool experience to be performing this sort of classical instrumental music that is so prominent in film soundtracks. And yeah, it's just really interesting to hear, especially from, having more experience playing these sort of instrumental music, like just listening to these soundtracks where an orchestra is playing. It's just really beautiful and really moving. But also electronic scores is another big part of like my love for instrumental music. I think when people typically like think of movie scores and soundtracks, I think it's just like boring, orchestral music. But as we'll talk about later, there's all different sorts, and electronic scores are something that I really enjoy. And just my general love of film, besides music, film is probably my favorite art medium. So of course I'm going to try to engage with it in as many ways as possible. And yeah, so what personal connections do you have to music and film?
Well, like you were saying, it's definitely one of my favorite mediums as well. Like, I'm planning to go to school to study film, and I'm currently like working on a film. I'm part of like Tao short film, and we had to like look for like composers and stuff we wanted on our soundtrack. So I felt really excited to like talk about music and film because I feel like it's a really important pair. Like, I'm also taking like this fashion design class, and we learned about how like fashion and film, like they seem hand in hand, but they weren't like considered like hand in hand before. So I feel like that's kind of like how it is with like music. Like we like just automatically like associate it with film, but I feel like throughout history it just became that, like it became hand in hand.
Yeah, for sure. But before we dive into what our favorite scores and soundtracks are, we wanted to make the difference between a score and a soundtrack. So what is the difference between a score and a soundtrack? Well, according to Masterclass, a score is the specific musical piece or incidental music that accompanies a scene or moment in film, and a soundtrack is a sort of compilation of songs and sounds that comprise all of the film's music. Typically, with a score, a filmmaker will hire a composer that will compose original music for the film, and a soundtrack it can be like selections from pre-existing songs, or they can be like original soundtracks and recorded specifically for the film. But what makes soundtracks sort of unique is they can also feature like vocal snippets of like dialogue or like specific moments in the film, like from the Pulp Fiction soundtrack, there's the famous Ezekiel 25:17 monologue that Samuel L. Jackson has. So I think that's what's kind of special about a soundtrack. It's not just music within the film. It can just be like recorded bits of the film that just fit the overall mood and tone.
Yeah, it's definitely good to like differentiate that. Like, I don't know as much about scores, but I really pay more attention to soundtracks, so I think it'll be a great conversation today because you're more about scores, I'm more about soundtracks, half and half.
Yeah, so Xandra, how do scores and soundtracks sort of shape the movie's theme or just overall mood?
I feel like it definitely just like adds to the scene it can also like give context because depending on the music, it can just be a completely different mood. Like it could be like scary music or it could be like sad music, and that'll just make a completely different scene.
Yeah, for sure. I think it adds a lot of like depth or, like you said, context to the movie that's important to have in films. So I guess we can just talk about our favorite scores and soundtracks. What are some of your favorites?
Ooh, I was so excited for this part. I love talking about my favorite things. Definitely Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah,
Like
nice.
that soundtrack, it was so beautiful. Like, um, it was interesting seeing what like the artist thought about the soundtrack because there's this song. It's called "This Is a Life." Um, Created by Mitski and Sun Lux, and they kind of talked about how they like infused like humor into their work, but like when you hear that song, it sounds like a really like slow, sad type of song. I'm kind of confused how they were talking about like infusing humor. I'm not sure if they're talking specifically about that song, but it's really interesting to see the perspective, like how they like view the work they make and then how the people that listen to the work they make view it as well.
Yeah. That was such an interesting movie. I finished it last
Yeah.
night. It is so like original and unique. There's really nothing like it, and the soundtrack as well is so like lush and like atmospheric almost. And I didn't know about the Mitski involvement. That's really cool.
Yeah. It played like during the end credits, so some folks might not have stayed for
Yeah.
that, but they should have. They should have stayed for it.
Yeah. Another film that you mentioned was also the Shang-Chi film, whose soundtrack I did listen to. There were some really enjoyable parts of that, and it was really just kind of a star-studded soundtrack. Like a lot of people were featured on there, like 21 Savage and like DJ Snake, and like I didn't realize, and all these 88 Rising artists as well. I didn't realize that was
Yeah.
a collaboration that happened.
Yeah, it was definitely like so cool to see because like Shang-Chi, he's the first like Asian Marvel superhero. So then to have that soundtrack paired with 88 Rising, which is like a record primarily for like Asian Americans, it's so cool to see that representation in film
Yeah.
because it's like, oh, it makes people feel like seen, like they can do this as well. It was such a good movie. I love the soundtrack because of just how lively it is. It really puts the action in the movie.
I feel like it's a perfect pairing, sort of having the first like Asian superhero, and then also 88 Rising, who's like a primarily Asian label, and having the two like collab together. I think it worked really, really well. And I feel like a lot of Marvel soundtracks, like they don't really have that sort of like original soundtrack
Yeah.
type of thing. I feel like
Yeah.
Shang-Chi was that's the only one that comes to mind when I can think of original music recorded for the movie. So I think that was a really
Yeah.
cool step for Marvel as well.
For sure. Yeah, like now that you like mentioned that, when I think about Marvel, I kind of think about that usual like superhero sound, but I feel like Shang-Chi really like kind of broke that mold, which I like about it.
Yeah, and hopefully in the future, maybe some more Marvel movies can feature more like
Yeah.
original soundtracks, just make the movie a little bit more interesting.
For sure, for
add a little bit
sure.
more depth.
Yeah, and continuing on a little bit about that, like Nikki, one of the 88 Rising artists, she created the song called Every Summertime for Shang-Chi. And I really enjoyed it because she kind of like went into like a different like time frame and wrote from that perspective. She she said that she likes to like challenge herself to write songs that she hasn't like lived in. So I thought that was a really interesting song. Like I even love like the music video where it's kind of like this little kid like back in the old days like going to baseball practice. It's really unique.
Mm-hmm.
You listen to the soundtracks.
Mm-hmm.
What was like your favorite part about it?
I just like how it was so unexpected, I guess. I didn't really know what I was getting into when listening to the Shang-Chi soundtrack. I wasn't even aware that it was a soundtrack. I thought it was just a score, just like instrumental music. So I was pleasantly surprised when it was an original soundtrack. But yes, there was one song, I can't remember the name of it. I think it's the first song on there. But that I really loved that one, and just I liked how lively it was and how entertaining the score was just while listening to it. And again, that sort of collaboration with, or the unlikely collaborations with 88 Rising and then other artists like 21 Savage, Saweetie. I think it's just really cool to see and have those people build connections within the music industry, and it worked pretty well. Like I feel like it was sort of a risk, but I think it paid off really well, especially for a Marvel movie. But yeah, I'm hoping in the future, like Marvel or just these major like film franchises in general can like feature some of these artists and create like their own original soundtracks, because personally Marvel's been a little lacking for me lately.
A little bit.
So I feel like by featuring those artists and just creating like an original soundtrack, it might be a little bit more engaging for the audience.
Yeah, for sure. And something that really stood out was like the rap collaborations. I've been following a couple of these artists for a while, like Audrey Nuna, Rich Brian, and it was really cool like to see that growth, 88 Rising starting out as this like label that you don't really know, and then it's in a Marvel movie. Like that's such a step up, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like provides a lot of exposure for these artists, like these smaller artists. So I thought that was really special, especially for a Marvel movie,
Yeah, for sure. So, what's some of your favorite scores?
Scores, I don't really know how I got into listening to scores. I think it was really just this year I've started expanding my music taste to scores, because I feel like those can be overlooked a lot. And like I said before, some people think it's, just boring orchestral music. But really, if there's a show that you just like the whole atmosphere and story of, I will like go and listen to the soundtrack as well, or the score, because it, a part of that whole atmosphere that I like latch onto with the film is because of the music. So a really good example of that was the Twin Peaks score. That was a show I started watching this year, and it is such a weird show, but the music also adds to that weirdness, and it's very special. The composer is Angelo Badalamenti, I believe is how you say his name. I love the atmosphere he creates. He collabs a lot with David Lynch, the filmmaker who created Twin Peaks and a lot of other movies and shows as well. He makes very like dreamlike and very unsettling movies, and I think Angelo sort of adds to that with his music. Also, Twin Peaks is set in Washington, and the music he created for the show, I feel like kind of like embodies Washington a lot, like that sort of mysterious, eerie, like forest vibe, you know what I mean? And actually, David Lynch described the feel of the show as a girl alone in the woods while the sycamore trees sway in the wind, and I feel like that is very accurate to the show, and I think Badalamenti sort of took that to the extreme when he's creating his music. But what's cool about Twin Peaks, it was also produced by David Lynch and Angelo Badalamenti, so there was that like collaboration there as well. And while it is mostly instrumental, 3 of the tracks include vocals from a dream pop singer named Julie Cruz. She has such a really pretty voice. It really adds to that like haunting vibe of the show. But the Twin Peaks theme won Best Pop Instrumental Performance at the Grammys in 1991, which is really, really interesting. I didn't really know that before. But it's very dark, jazzy, and it fits the tender moments in the show as well as the more sinister ones. And the best way I can describe it is from the Apple Music description, really. The rest of the Twin Peaks score moves in similar shadows, stalking between noir moods and romantic swoon, cool jazz and warm dream pop. It's a musical universe befitting Twin Peaks, Washington itself. Slow motion tempos, velvety synths, gently brushed drums, vibraphones, twangy guitar, simple melodies, dissonance, and a liberal coating of reverb. That's really the best way I can describe it sonically. It's just a really beautiful soundtrack. And I feel like the score doesn't need visuals to achieve a sense of unnatural beauty. So even if you've never seen the show, you can still be like in awe of the score, and maybe it'll convince you to watch the show as well. And a fun fact I had about the score was Laura Palmer, who's the main one of the main characters. Her theme from Twin Peaks was actually improvised. So I don't know, it's kind of interesting. And sadly, Angelo Badalamenti died in December of 2022, which is pretty sad. It was a death that was just like, well, that's crazy, you know? Yeah. And yeah, his work is amazing. He will be greatly missed. But moving on from that, some other scores that are just kind of, you can't really talk about scores without mentioning these people that I feel like they're just very iconic. But John Williams and Hans Zimmer. John Williams composed some of the most iconic themes like Jaws, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Harry Potter, literally everything. And I felt like mentioning him was, I felt owed to, just because he's created some of the most iconic themes in film and in music. Same with Hans Zimmer. He does a really good job of blending sort of like electronic sounds and orchestral arrangements. He's done some iconic films like Lion King, Gladiator, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dark Knight trilogy, Inception, so on. But yeah, he's a really, really talented guy. They both are, and I love how they've created some of these iconic themes, like just the same people doing it. It's crazy. But also, speaking of electronic sounds, 2 scores that are sort of more electronic based are the Social Network's score and the Fight Club score, which both movies are great, and I almost like the scores better than the movies itself. But they're very dark and tortured almost, and angsty, and I really like the atmosphere that the 2 created. But both films were directed by David Fincher, so obviously I have that like love there for that. And there's similarities between the movies and the scores as well. But yeah, I love the dark sort of electronic, trip hop sort of vibe to it. And it's just very interesting to listen to. And, if you're not really into a lot of scores, I feel like these 2 are really good ones to change your mind, because they prove that scores go beyond just orchestral music. They can be interesting and intricate with electronic music as well.
Yeah. That's a lot. Like, personally, I feel like I haven't been giving enough credits to scores. I'll be real with you. Like, after hearing all of these, like, I listened to Twin Peaks because you said you really liked that score, and when I listened to it, I definitely felt like a forest vibe type of setting, and I have like no context on what that show actually is.
Yeah.
But when you like describe like a girl alone in the woods while the sycamore trees sway in the winds, like I got that feeling just from listening to the score, like no context at all. So it's definitely interesting to hear, well, to see how like effective that composer is able to make you like feel.
Yeah. That's what I just love about music and film as well. Just, making the audience feel that emotion without even seeing the film as well. And the last thing I will talk about with my favorite scores and soundtracks, 'cause I've been talking a lot, but with soundtracks, I really, really love Purple Rain by Prince. It's not only one of the greatest soundtracks of all time, but just one of the greatest albums of all time. He was the first artist to have top album, movie, and single at the same time, which is just crazy to think about. That's not easy to do. But he was a really underrated guitarist, I feel like. And some of his best guitar moments come from this album. And I think what makes Purple Rain so special is because it got a little experimental at times. For example, on the song When Doves Cry, there's no bass line. He just didn't feel like there was a need for one, which is really interesting. But he blends a lot of elements of like pop and funk, R&B, rock, to be really effective and beautiful. But Purple Rain has obviously had a big cultural impact on pop culture, but also just in the music and film world. I haven't seen the movie personally, so I don't know. But yeah, there's a song that's quite infamous, Darling Nikki, which actually created the parental advisory sticker.
Wow.
Yeah, so yeah, that was a whole story behind that. But yeah, so I guess, yeah, people just created that sticker because it was such a, filthy song. So, but now we don't really even think of the parental advisory sticker. It's just there. We've gotten so used to it. But yeah, that just is one example of the cultural impact that album really had on society, and it's just such a beautiful album, really.
Yeah, I love that. I had no idea about the parental advisory sticker thing. Like, wow, that's a big deal. I'm shocked.
Yeah.
That's all I can say about it. But yeah, I definitely love what you've been talking about scores, like kind of having like an electronic vibe to it. I think that definitely like makes it stand out from what we usually think like a score is, like you've been saying. Like I have been someone to kind of imagine scores as like more like orchestra based. So I think like having a score that sort of like defies that expectation definitely makes it stand out.
Yeah, I feel like people sort of take it for granted, which I completely understand, because it is a lot easier to listen to like, a Drake album versus a instrumental album, especially if you haven't seen the movie, and you're just listening to the music, and it just, I don't know. Again, like what you said, how music adds to the context of the film. It is hard to just sit there and listen to a score when you haven't seen the film or you're not really sure what it is. So yeah, I definitely see the connection there.
Yeah. Going back to something you said something about like improvisation. Could you reiterate about that? Like, what was improvised? Like,
I think it was just the melody.
Melody?
I'm not too sure on the like story behind it. I think he might have just been, goofing around on a piano.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But yeah, I think improvisation is something really cool in music, and it's not just in scores and soundtracks, but just music in general.
Exactly.
Some of the coolest parts and songs of music have come from improvisation, especially there's some genres that rely on that, like jazz.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I just thought it was interesting how he improvised that theme, especially when it is such a beloved piece of work, and it is very prominent throughout the TV show too. It always plays like constantly, and it's like, oh my gosh, this song is like stuck in my head, and like I didn't realize that it was improvised, and I think that's just really cool how he was able to pull that out of his just at the top of his head, didn't have to think about it too much, and created this iconic theme.
Yeah, for sure. Like improvisation, such a cool skill. Like it reminded me of Everything Ever All at Once. The actor that plays Joy, I believe her name is Stephanie Shu. When she was auditioning for that role, there was like one line they asked her to say, and then they asked her, can you like sing that line? Can you put a tune to it?" And then they liked her tune so much that they like kept it in the film, and it's like such a like sort of like significant part of the film that you remember, like gets like stuck in your head, the melody, even though it's just one like simple line, it had lots of impact just from an improvised line like while she was auditioning, which is really cool to me.
Yeah. Is that like the bagel song?
Yeah,
it's such a random part.
Yeah.
That movie is very random.
It was really random. It was a lot.
But yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that was improvised either. And it was such a cool part of the movie as well. So I still don't understand it. Like the bagel part, I'm like, oh my goodness.
It was a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot to take in. But again, that's a really awesome film, but an even awesomer soundtrack as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, why are scores and soundtracks an essential part of film and TV shows? I think you kind of said it best, adding context to the film and to the soundtrack as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like, just setting the tone, adding context. Like what I was talking about, we used to think that like fashion and film were hand in hand, but it sort of became hand in hand because it added so much context, so much significance to the film, to the scenes that we're creating.
And like I said, it adds depth and emotion to the films that we see. And I feel like without music, a movie would be really weird to watch. I did research a few movies that don't really have any music to it. I haven't seen any of them, but I'm wondering if they do it effectively. So that might be something I have to check out as well. But I feel like this is also a really great example of how artists of different mediums can come together and create something just really beautiful and original. You know, filmmakers and musicians just collaborating and making something really interesting and worthwhile. And I love how art can bring people together like that, even if they work on different, art mediums. Like you said, they go hand in hand perfectly. So.
Exactly, yeah.
So I guess the main thing is don't take scores for granted.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do have a deep love of scores and soundtracks just because it does relate to film a lot. Like I said, film is one of my favorite art mediums. So yeah, I just love how the two can work off of each other.
Exactly.
As well.
Yeah. It's definitely interesting to see like which of these soundtracks and scores like win awards. Like you just wonder like the thinking that goes through all of that. I think, I don't know, was this for the Grammys or the Oscars?
Yeah.
They won All Quiet on the Western Front, which is like a war movie. It won. Do you remember the award?
I think it was the Oscars, I believe.
The Oscars?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I actually I don't really watch war movies, so I can't even speak on this, but another film that was nominated was Babylon, and it had like such a jazz, lively, and kind of like imagine like a prestige party type of feeling to it. And it was really interesting to see that the composer Justin Hurwitz, I believe, also composed the La La Land soundtrack. And I think like being able to make a soundtrack and then another soundtrack that's two different ones, but being able to see like the connection really like makes a good composer, because you can see their style, you can like identify them. Like I don't know much about composers and such, but when I heard the sound, it reminded me so much of La La Land, and to find out it's the same composer is just such a cool thing.
Yeah, that range, I guess, with composers is really cool too. And he did the Whiplash movie as well, and that's such an interesting film, and I love the jazzy bits of it. But yeah, that's really cool. You were able to make that connection between La La Land and Babylon, and just hearing similarities and finding out it's the same composer. Like, that's really cool.
So before we end this, just want to give some honorable mentions of soundtracks or scores that you should listen to. Definitely loved Pulp Fiction and like Wes Anderson films like The French Dispatch.
For sure.
Yeah. And okay, hear me out. This one, Encanto. Like, I know there's that one song that like.
Yeah, We Don't Talk About Bruno.
But like overall, it was a cute little soundtrack. I think you should listen to it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So.
Yeah. I'm not too familiar with Encanto, so I mean, Disney soundtracks are a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
They're iconic in their own right, and maybe we'll do an episode just on Disney soundtracks. But yeah, those are really fun and just a big part of a lot of people's childhood as well. You can check out our top playlist in the description and just hear the songs we have been listening to this month.
So what songs have you been listening to?
Well, going back to sort of listening to a lot of music in preparation for this episode, I've been listening to a lot of Prince, not just Purple Rain like I mentioned, but just his other work as well. And he really just was one of the greatest entertainers, I feel like. He just had so much brilliance that he put into every single song and every single second of his music. And Sign of the Times was an album I've been listening to a lot this month, and it's very dense and grand and just beautiful. And yeah, he just was, I can't even put into words how much I admire him. He's just such a magnificent entertainer, and there's really no one like him, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, what about you? What have you been listening to?
This surprised me, but I've been listening to this song called Drive Me Crazy by Lil Yachty. It's just like, I never expected to be listening to Lil Yachty.
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
I know, like the indie rock album he dropped just really surprised everyone. And I think it's really cool how he was able to make that transition. And it seems pretty genuine too.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it's really interesting for him to be doing that. He's the last person I expected to be doing it.
Yeah.
But he made a good album, so I can't
complain.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, so that's a wrap for this month's tap.
The music you're hearing is called Periwinkle by Totem Star artist Aleyanna Grae.
Grant Vu edited this episode.
And we want to thank the Vera Project for welcoming us into their space, and Ground Zero Radio for their support in the production of this podcast.
Finally, huge thank yous to our off-mic teammates, Josh and Triona, and all the other folks at TeenTix whose work makes this podcast possible.
You've been listening to the TeenTix Arts Podcast, uplifting youth voices and artists in the local music scene through access to education and critical discussion.